Last week we looked at the characteristics or the attributes of a necessary existent. And some of these attributes that we concluded with through intellectual deduction is that a necessary existent has to be independent. It is the first cause of all other existences. It is eternal. It cannot be made up of any physical or intellectual parts, nor does it have a body, nor is it limited with space or time. And when we look at these characteristics of a necessary existent from a religious worldview, where we look at very unique and distinguishing attributes that this necessary existence has to possess, we then can call this necessary existence as a God. And it is this conclusion that we have reached to for the past few weeks, that we finally come to the point where we can prove the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today we look at some of the more distinguishing attributes that Allah Azza wa Jal has, again to prove this through an intellectual means or an understanding. When we look at attributes that any entity, any being possesses, these attributes are generally described in two ways. One is attributes that have to do with the person directly. These are called ontological attributes. So you describe that person. That person has life. That person has power. That person has knowledge, for example. It has to do with the entity themselves. The second form of attributes are based on the relationship that that person has with other people. That person is kind. That person is merciful. These are attributes that only stem or come about in their interactions with other people. Similarly, when we look at the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His attributes are also divided along these two lines. There is what's known as sifatul dhatiyah. These are the attributes of essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, things that describe God Himself. And then there are attributes which are known as sifatul fi'liyah. Sifatul fi'liyah are the action attributes of God, which only stem or manifest in His interaction with His creation. Today we will focus on the attributes of essence, the sifatul dhatiyah, and in particular three attributes. The attribute of life, hayat, the attribute of knowledge, ilm, and the attribute of power, qudra. And we will prove how we dissect and reach the conclusion that God has to have life, power, and knowledge. But before we get into that, the description of these attributes or the proof of these attributes, which is quite simple to be quite honest, what we have to understand when we talk about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are a few points that need to be understood. The first point that needs to be understood is that when we begin to describe the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, I say God has knowledge, God has power, God has life or hayat, it's very important that while I am describing these attributes, I am mindful of the fact that these attributes, the way I am describing it, are limited. Not that God's attributes are limited, but my description of these attributes are limited. So no matter how eloquently I can describe power, that power that I am imagining will always be deficient compared to the power that God truly possesses. Right? And this is because I am limited with vocabulary, I am limited through imagination, I am limited with understanding and language. I am bound by these limitations, but there are no limits that are holding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, whatever description we provide to God, in the back of our minds, we have to be mindful and understanding that these are just my understandings, but God is greater. And this is what Allahu Akbar means. You know, when we say Allah is greater, the true meaning of Allahu Akbar is Allahu Akbar min an yusaf, that Allah is greater than to even be described. Yeah, and this is that full sentence of Allahu Akbar that we don't say, but it should be in our minds that when we say Allah is greater, greater than what? Not greater than me, because then I am comparing myself to God. Not greater than the knowledge someone has, because I am comparing that knowledge to God's knowledge. But when I say Allahu Akbar, what I'm truly saying is that God is greater than to even be described. Yeah? And so we have to always keep in mind when we talk about that. Secondly, when we talk about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to be mindful of where our descriptions and understandings of these attributes are stemming from. Generally in life, we learn through our experiences, and we compare and we understand and we describe based on that. So for example, I may see someone who's really smart, but then I will say, but God is smarter. Yeah, I will see somebody who's really knowledgeable, right? This is how, in my interaction with young children, this is how they talk. Yeah, they say, you're nice, but God is nicer. Yeah, you're strong, but God is stronger. And what we have to understand is that when we describe something in this way, this is something that is very natural. However, it is important to realize that God is above and beyond this, right? That God is not a comparative greater. Rather, God is just greater. Right? And we come a further step when it comes to the description of these attributes, is that when we look at the attributes in our world today, right, it is something that is accidental. So for example, I am a person who did not have life at one time, and then I was put into this world and now I have life. Life is not part of my ontological perfection. Rather, life is an accidental quality that I have gained over time. Similarly, there could be a moment when I didn't know something, and then I Googled something or I read a book and now I gained knowledge. We can't say that that knowledge was always a part of me. No, that knowledge was something that was added on to me while previously I did not have that knowledge. Similarly with strength, at one time I was not strong. I went to the gym, I gained strength. Now strength is an attribute of who I am, but these attributes are not fundamentally part of who I am. But when we describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is quite different, isn't it? We can't say that Allah has knowledge. Because when I phrase that statement in that way, what I'm saying is that Allah is one thing, knowledge is something else, and Allah has that thing. And if I can describe it in that way, that means there was a time when Allah did not have knowledge. Or there was a time when I can separate knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore when we describe the qualities and the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I don't say Allah has knowledge. I say Allah is knowledge. Yeah? Allah is power. Allah is life, because there is no difference between life, power and knowledge and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We just separate these descriptions for the sake of our own understanding. If we understand all of these preliminary points, I think it's important that we understand these points. We come to the simple proof about the attributes of life, about the attributes of power and the attributes of knowledge. The simple proof to prove these attributes exist in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that when these attributes are used to describe any creation, if for example I say a creation has life, or a creation has power, or a creation has knowledge, I am in some ways describing an ontological perfection within that creation. It is not a negative to say to someone that person has knowledge. It is not negative to say that person has power. It is something that describes a form of perfection that exists within a human being. If in the creation these attributes exist as a form of perfection, then it is impossible for these attributes not to exist in the primary cause who gave us existence. You understand? Yeah? This point is really important, okay? This point is really important. That how can I have an attribute when the cause that brought me into existence not have that attribute? There's a statement in Arabic philosophy that's known, faqidu shay la yu'ti. Someone that does not have something cannot give it to someone else. And therefore, if I have life, the one who created me must have life. If I have power, then the one who created me must have power. If I have knowledge, the one who created me must have knowledge. And not only must that creation have these attributes, that these attributes cannot decline in that entity as it gives it to other people. Right? And therefore the attributes of life, power and knowledge exist in Allah in an eternal manner, that He provides it to us, nor does it diminish as He gives it to the rest of His creation. And therefore because we see it in us, it has to exist in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a very simple proof, but a proof that makes a lot of sense if we reflect on the depths of it. The last thing I want to add to this is that even though these perfections are with Allah Azza wa Jal, the ontological perfections of life, knowledge and power, the fact that Allah possesses the power to perform everything doesn't mean that He will do everything. Right? So Allah Azza wa Jal only acts based on what He intends to do, irada, and we will talk about irada in future lectures because irada is an important concept that we have to understand. The will or the desire of Allah Azza wa Jal. And also Allah will only act based on what is wise. Yeah, He's Hakim. And so wisdom and irada, wisdom and will are important attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal that will determine what He will do. But what this teaches us is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not perform that which does not have the possibility of actualization. Right? And so sometimes people ask that can God create another God? Yeah? Can Allah, for example, make the number 2 larger than the number 3? Can Allah take this whole world and put it in an egg? Yeah? People ask this, can Allah create a rock that God Himself can't lift? Yeah? These are questions that people ask to try to put us in a bind to say, well, then your God is not perfect. Then your God is not all omnipotent. And so it's very interesting how this question is answered. Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, in his book Theistic Arguments, he describes a hadith of our 6th Imam as-Sadiq alayhi afdalu salatu was-salam. Salli ala Muhammad, ali Muhammad. He was asked, can Allah place this entire world into an egg? And the Imam alayhi salam replied and he said, although God's power is infinite, what you are asking is nothing. Yeah? What you are asking is what's known as la shay, nothing. La shay means it's not a thing, right? And nothing, like non-existence, is a concept which does not have an external extension. You follow? If something is not real, you can't have it extended in reality because it's not real. You may be able to imagine certain thing, but in reality that thing does not exist. Because therefore, Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli says, because it is la shay, it is not subject to the infinite power of God. In other words, Allah can do everything, but an impossibility is not a thing. Understand that too, yeah? This is really important for us to understand. So when people pose that question, really the answer is this is not a thing. God can do everything, but what you're describing is not even a thing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do. And therefore, yes, He is powerful, but then these things have to be in actuality and governed by His wisdom and governed by His intention. Inshallah, we will pause here, and if God gives us life, we will continue next week. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.